Hey guys, it's Mr. Amatsu coming in with your Period 6 Khan Academy Westward expansion. So this is first part about Period 6. We're going to talk about the West because it was developing. Kind of do a little bit of rewind actually. We're going to even go all the way back to 1848, which was before the Civil War. So again, if you guys notice, the Period 5 was really talking about territorial expansion, but we really didn't talk about what happened when we got the lands of the West. When we got the Mexican secession. And so that's going to go a little bit more into this and talk about the development of the West. Also, later in another screencast, we'll talk about the New South. We already know some of the problems that are the South is already facing. In my opinion, that definitely would be problems such as segregation and racism. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that and talk about the Supreme Court's decision to legally allow segregation in the South and throughout the entire United States. And then after that, we're going to really talk about the Gilded Age, what we call the rise of business and big business, the rise of industry, the rise of railroads, which was a huge communication and transportation network that they had a monopoly on. Talk about the word monopoly, so we know what that is, and also what's happening to the individual worker at that time. So that's kind of overview of Period 6. Let's go into what we're talking about today, which will be about basically a focus on the West. All right. We already know that there is a party called the Free Soil Party, and here's an image of them right now. It shows definitely farming. But I just want to remind you guys that, the Free Soil Party, really, they wanted it to be for free, independent farmers. I don't think they necessarily, some free soilers, not all, but some probably didn't care less at certain levels about where slavery existed, as long as it wasn't in land that they wanted that they would have to compete with. Remember that slavery was seen as an economic power that northern and other and even small southern farmers had to compete with, and try to get that competition. So that's going to be talking a little bit more about the idea that this land should be free, which it definitely does after the Civil War. One act that's created is the Homestead Act, which basically gives you, if you want to, free land, free public land for it to develop. Remember that land is useless if it's not doing anything. I like preserving the land and like preserving the environment, but from an economic point of view, you want to develop it. You want your people to make something from it, and you want to tax those goods that they make or that income that they make. So develop the land. So the Homestead Act that it's going to talk about really is what's going to be pushing migration as it moves west. So we'll talk about that. At this time, in 1865, we definitely have people in California. They definitely have statehoods. We're up at 60,000, but we have yet to have a lot of these states come in the union. A lot of these states will not come in the union until the 1890s, guys. So we're seeing a push westward. And what are some of the things that they're looking for? Yeah, definitely we're looking for some ranching and some cowboys down here, literally literally cows. The Great Plains, they are moving into agriculture, focusing really on single cash crops such as wheat and corn. This will later become the breadbasket of the world, as a lot of our cereals and a lot of our foods are made. Guys, all of your chips are pretty much made out of corn, right? So super important. This area is definitely going to be least populated as it is today. But there are also a lot of silver mines in Nevada that can be found. Obviously, a lot of gold mining that was here. And then just regular economic issues are happening here because these are just ports. So remember that when you have a trading area, you need restaurants, you need hotels, you need liquor stores, you need all the things that a city requires. So along the coast, we're going to see development of different types of economies as we see today. So this area, again, just as it is now, not really that populated, not a lot of economic activities. If there is, it's a lot of agriculture and ranching. Same thing as goes down here, silver mining kind of in this region, and more of these kind of like what we call East Coast kind of economic activities, trade, commerce, business. Like Wells Fargo is a banking, that was really about going to the West Coast, right? During that time, which kind of shows up as a massive bank at this time. Western Union, a way to telegraph money from one coast to the other coast, right? Western, right? Going west. Okay. This definitely is, if you're like going back and you're like, this seems like a different period. Isn't this like Manifest Destiny? It absolutely is, right? This is a continuation of that. Remember, we're talking about the gold rush of 1849. So we're kind of rewinding the history of the West a little bit and going from the 1850s on. Okay, so during the spur of Manifest Destiny, this is how they get there. One really extensive, technology that the North, especially, and you can see it here, right? these northern lines, and this is 1860, right before the breakout of the Civil War. You can see how the North and Abraham Lincoln really had focused on the law lines. You're looking at this area here and going, what's going on? That's the Appalachian Mountain, guys. Really rural area. Remember, this is the proclamation line of 1763 was right through that area. All right, so that's why this kind of these lines are kind of stopping. But the growth of, I saw this one. This is 1890. You can just see the growth of railroads and how they moved over. And all the different population centers that were popping in. We're going to talk about it later, but railroads acquired a lot of wealth. They basically got all this land for free because the government saw railroads as important not only to the northern success and industrialization before the Civil War and during the Civil War, but after the Civil War for economics. So railroads are going to get a lot of land. And with this land, they're actually going to sell some of the extra land for a lot of money back to individuals. So railroads are making a lot of money at this time. They're basically the Amazon of the entire United States at this time about controlling goods and warehouses and how you get it from somebody that makes it, right? That's what Amazon does, is somebody wants it, right? So they're definitely a massive Amazon this time, and they're getting also wealth through lands. Through the land that they get. So they're getting it two ways. And they're using this wealth to influence and buy off people in Washington, D.C. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this period, how business began to corrupt government officially and unofficially. I think it was a student in one of my classes, students usually always ask, why is it turned into squares? What happened is they would give the land in a checkerboard fashion. Right. And so those, sometimes we have geographic features. Like a lot of people, obviously, we use rivers, right, as geographic features to cut off pieces of land territory. But a lot of these squares where you're coming out, the reason being is because that's how the land was given. And the railroad actually did it in this way to make sure that they even got more land. I'm not going to get into it, but there's a History Channel series called How the States Got Their Shape. So check it out if you want to. I'm sure it's on YouTube. So the growth of railroads, super important, like we had talked about. The farmers are going to run into these issues when we're talking about the West. And one of the biggest issues that they're going to have is falling prices and the rising cost to transport them. So let's talk about one. Technology is going to increase, and technology is awesome when it makes your life easier. But if you make too much of something, the value of it goes down, right? If something that's super rare is worth a lot of money, right? That's why gold is theoretically rare. That's why diamonds are theoretically rare because they're hard to find. But something that's easy to find and there's a lot of it, it's going to be less expensive, right? So just as a heads up, that is what's happening to farmers. They're overproducing. Their supply is high, causing the price to shoot down, and they're starting to lose money. In addition to that, they are being forced by railroads to pay really, really high amounts. And so these two forces really hit farmers at the same time. Remember, most of our economy at this time is farmers, right? We'll be transitioning in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and 50s into kind of a little bit more of like a factory city type of thing. But we're still kind of an agrarian, somewhat society. And a lot of individuals are losing money because of supply. They're paying too much money to transport their goods, and they're frustrated. And so they begin by creating political alliances. And later we'll have something called the Populist Party that's going to include things like prohibition, the idea of silver instead of gold to back up our currency, the idea of producing paper money. You also get union members. But here I'm going to show you, you can see it says Old Granger Party and Farmers Alliance, which we'll talk about. So these two groups are coming together because of those farmer issues. And later they're going to be united under the Populist Party. And the Populist Party at certain levels is going to lead into the Progressive Party that we'll talk about and a little bit more in period 6. Oh, sorry, period 7. 6 and 7, kind of a little bit. Populists are period 6, and the Progressives will be period 7. Another thing that comes in as we move west, obviously, is always Indians. The Plains Indians, especially, are there's this incredible pictures of these buffalo bison heads that are just, they're just mountains and hills tall of people just killing all of these bison because they're in railroad tracks, they're on the land, and they're wanting to develop it, in barbed wire. So anyways, not to detach too much, but the Great Plains Indians really lose a really important resource for them, which is the buffalo, due to the economic development of America as they moved west, especially with railroads and farmers. In regards to the American Indians, you're going to learn about the Dawes Act, and it really takes away some of the power that these sovereign nations had on their reservations, which was kind of given to them. And it's kind of a force to assimilate Native Americans into into American culture. I worked at a bank, and there was actually I forgot the tribe, but up in San Juan Capistrano, there's a tribe, and there was a tribal leader, and she talked about having to go to these boarding schools. She was the only Native American. It was largely all white. She had to cut her hair. You had to dress a certain way, or actually she could keep her hair, but the boys would obviously have to cut their hair because they'd have much longer hair. So just to assimilate into American culture, right? To put them into American culture and take away at certain levels our Native American heritage. So a very hard time for the Native American population, as most of, unfortunately, American history is. Another thing is on the West, guys, remember that we have, my Japanese are coming in, Chinese are coming in, and people are moving in on the West Coast. The Chinese are moving into areas like San Francisco and the West Coast for all types of services to be provided towards all the people that are coming in. But a large amount of them are working on the railroads, those railroads that we had shown you that started growing right over here in the West. So a lot of these railroads are being done. And because of that, there's going to be economic issues and also an outcry of nativism. This is an example of what we call the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I just want to kind of show you this, that the only one barred out, so he can't come in. They basically stopped Chinese from coming in. And it's pretty funny. Notice communists, we'll talk about that later, nihilists, people that believe in nothing, socialists, which is kind of a version of communists. I don't know what Fenian means, but hoodlums, welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen, right? And he's bringing an industry, he's building industry, he's bringing an order, peace, he's sober, right? And here's the American flag. So obviously this person is very critical of the Chinese Exclusion Act, feeling that the Chinese have a lot to offer, but they're being literally barred or stopped from entering the gates, the Golden Gate of Liberty. No, it says Golden Gate, like San Francisco, again, appeal to the West Coast. So just as a heads up, that's the Chinese Exclusion Act. All right, guys, so we focused on a big chunk of Period 6, which is the American West, and we'll be moving in, talk about the New South and more Period 6 in the next one. All right, see you guys. Take care.